Preserving eggs, sperm, and embryos through cryopreservation is done for a number of reasons. Today, we're specifically talking about embryo cryopreservation and what's involved in storing your precious reproductive resources. Embryologist Shannon Ferrell is with us to go behind the scenes so you can better understand all about what happens when we freeze and store your embryos. Shannon, hi, welcome back.
Hi, thank you.
So we're talking about cryopreservation. Can we dive into a little bit about what that is, cryopreservation of embryos?
Sure. So, in its most basic definition, cryopreservation is a method of preserving the embryos to be used at a later date. They're essentially frozen at that moment in time. They don't change metabolically, they're not growing. And then when the patient wants to use them, we thaw them and they basically pick up right where they left off.
And how do you go about freezing them?
Sure. We use a process called vitrification. It's different than what we think of when we think of regular freezing, like ice or, frozen vegetables. Freezing like that involves forming ice crystals, and ice crystals can damage the cells of an embryo. So in vitrification, it's a little safer. It's a lot safer, actually. And so the first thing that we do is we collapse the embryo, because a fully expanded embryo has this cavity that's full of liquid, which could form ice crystals. So we collapse it with the laser. Basically, it's like poking it. And then a lot of that extra liquid comes out of the embryo. And this is totally safe. It happens in normal embryo development. Embryos are always expanding and collapsing on their own. We just want to make sure it's in that collapsed state when we go to freeze it. And so that's the first step. And then once the embryo is collapsed and the extra liquid is out, we put the embryo in a series of cryoprotectant medias that are highly concentrated, and they help draw out any extra water that's hanging out in there. And the cryoprotectant coats the cells to protect them. And so they go through a series of the media, and then we put them on a device and place them directly in liquid nitrogen. So they are frozen instantly.
Wow.
Which is also different from frozen vegetables.
I didn't know that they were collapsed, so that's pretty interesting. That doesn't affect the embryo and at all when it's collapsed?
No, like I said, we just zap it with the laser once. We pick a spot on the embryo that it's not in the inner cell mass, which is the part that becomes the fetus. We do it on the trifectoderm, which will become the placenta, and we do it in between the cells. We just pick one little place to zap it. And like I said, the embryo naturally collapses and expands on its own without that. And so it's all part of the process.
Wow. What are some reasons for storing embryos?
Sure. I mean, the most common reason that people freeze their embryos is when they have extra. They come through and they do a fresh IVF cycle, and most people only transfer one or maybe two embryos, and then they might have some that are left over. And so we freeze them. So that way, if the patient is unfortunately not pregnant, they can come back for another cycle, or even if they are pregnant, they can keep those embryos for future use if they want to have more children down the line. And then another really common reason for freezing embryos is PGT, which is pre-implantation genetic testing. A lot of patients come through and want to do that genetic testing on their embryos. And so we biopsy the embryo, take a few cells and send that off for testing. And the testing takes 1 or 2 or sometimes longer weeks. And so we can't keep the embryo in culture for that long. So while we're waiting for the test results to come back, we freeze the embryos, and then the patient will come back and have a what we call a frozen embryo transfer cycle.
So after the embryo is created, at what stage of the embryo is it then frozen? What day?
Right. So we freeze embryos on days 5, 6, and 7 when it's at the blastocyst stage. And they have to be a good quality blastocyst too. Sometimes a patient may have very poor quality embryos, but they won't establish a pregnancy and they won't survive the freezing and thawing process. So we do not freeze those ones.
Got it. And how are they actually stored?
So embryos are stored. We use this device. We call it a straw, but it's not really a straw. It looks more like a coffee stirrer. I have one here.
Okay.
There.
They're little.
Yeah. And the little cap comes off, and this is all done under a microscope, so you're not really going to be able to see it here. But the embryo goes on the very tip of the straw, and it's frozen there directly in the liquid nitrogen. And then the straw goes on what we call a goblet. And then the goblet goes on what we call a cane, which is this. And so the straw and the goblet and the cane are all labeled, and the labels are all checked by multiple people so that there are no mistakes. And they are stored in these tanks full of liquid nitrogen. And those tanks are in a room that has limited access. You have to have access to that room. Not just anybody can walk in there. And then every tank is monitored. We fill it weekly with liquid nitrogen. We're always measuring it. And each tank also has its own alarm system. So if anything is wrong, we will get notified about it, even in the middle of the night.
Wow. Okay. So there are a lot of safety measures you take to make sure that these embryos stay frozen and safe.
Exactly.
Are there, how long do they stay good? How long can, how many years, or is there an expiration date on these embryos?
There is not an expiration date. Theoretically, as long as the embryo is stored properly, it could be good forever,
Mhm.
like years and years. I think the record is there was a patient in Tennessee that got pregnant from an embryo that was frozen for 27 years.
Yeah,
And
that's
then,
amazing.
yeah. And so then along those lines, it's also important to remember that once the embryo is frozen, it doesn't age. A lot of
Mm.
women know that as they get older, their fertility declines. However, if you have an embryo that you froze when you're 32, and then you come back to transfer it when you're 40, that embryo is still 32 years old. And it maintains that higher likelihood of success that comes with a younger age.
And because they're vitrified, or
Mhm.
is that the right word?
Yes, that's
Um,
the right word.
so they don't form ice crystals like it would be sort of like freezer burn?
Right, exactly. No freezer burn.
Got it. So what are the advantages of cryopreservation?
So, one of the advantages, another reason that I didn't mention about why people may freeze their embryos is not only for future use, but also sometimes at the end of a fresh IVF cycle, a patient's hormones or their uterine lining might not be exactly where we would like it to be for an embryo transfer. And
Mm.
we want to make sure that everything is perfect so the patient has the best chance of success. So in those cases, if they have, their progesterone is too high or they're at risk for hyperstimulation, we will freeze all of their embryos instead of having a fresh transfer. And then they can come back with another cycle when everything is perfect, and then we can thaw the embryo and put it back.
Oh, that's great that we can do that. And we talked about the safety of embryo cryopreservation. We talked a little bit about that. How safe is it?
It's extremely safe. We have a survival rate here of about 99%. It's
Wow.
extremely rare that an embryo does not survive the cryopreservation and thawing process. And then
Oh,
even sometimes patients need to ship their embryos to another clinic or from another clinic to us. And that is also very safe. We ship them in tanks that have liquid nitrogen vapors, and they have temperature monitors, and they're shipped overnight. And that's also very safe too.
once you're ready to freeze, how long does it actually take to freeze and then to thaw?
Sure. It takes about 10 minutes to freeze an embryo.
Hmm.
So that's really fast.
Yeah.
um, and then thawing, let me count in my head, it's about another 15 minutes to thaw.
Okay. So when someone is scheduled to have a transfer, then you time it accordingly.
Exactly. And we'll thaw it that morning. We'll thaw it in the morning, and then we'll take a picture. And sometimes, the embryo doesn't look great in the picture because it's still collapsed,
Uh-huh.
but it's totally healthy for anybody who's had a frozen embryo transfer. I'm sorry that your embryo is squished, but it's still healthy. And then it'll stay in culture for a couple of hours before its transfer.
So does the culture rehydrate, or do you also put
It
water?
does. So
Okay.
like through the thawing process, it goes sort of the opposite through an opposite series of media where it's gradually gently rehydrating the embryo, and then it sits in culture and it will re-expand.
Got it. That's good stuff. Thank you so much, Shannon. I appreciate your time and sharing, and I love the props as well.
Thank you.
And that's it for today on Lunchtime Live with the Center. You can learn more about cryopreservation on our website at uconnfertility.com. And we will see you next time. Bye for now.